Hello everyone, welcome back to Wake Up Call. It is great to talk to you again. Today we have another very interesting episode ready for you. We're talking with a very special guest. His name is Daan Weggemans. He's the program director of the Bachelor Security Studies and researcher at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs in the University of Leiden. His research includes studies on the lives and preparatory processes of foreign fighters, the role of families in radicalization, and the detention and reintegration of jihadist extremist offenders. He is also a research fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. Today, we will be talking about radicalization, indoctrination, brainwashing, and how all of these things appear in our society, how regular people being brainwashed perhaps differs from terrorism brainwashing, and how all of these things can be solved. Stay tuned for the episode, and we hope you like it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weggemans, for coming on the show. So our first question is basically, in your own words, how would you describe the work that you do?
Start off easy, right? So I'm a researcher in the field, and I'm starting to broaden up a bit. But I'm a philosopher by training and a sociologist. So much of the work I do starts as philosophers do in wonder. And the thing I wonder about most is contemporary security issues. So things that happen in our contemporary world, in our modern societies, which somehow bring security and safety questions and dilemmas to the front. And most of the work I've been doing in relation to that has been on the field of terrorism and radicalization. And my research is mostly characterized by a qualitative approach. So I do a lot of interviewing, talking to people who we fear as a society, who are, at the same time we're fascinated by. So it's only a couple of people, it's a small portion of society, but still they're spectacular. So that's what I try to do and see if the very basic questions. So who are they and what do they do has been a very guiding question in most of my work. So related to radicalization and terrorism, that's basically what I do.
Yeah, you mentioned that your sphere of research is definitely very relevant today, and I feel like in order for us to have a good conversation, we have to set some terms that we're talking about, because the terms radicalization, indoctrination seem to be really thrown around a lot. So maybe you could explain briefly what is the difference between, for example, brainwashing, radicalization, and indoctrination.
Well, as many academic debates start, and that's also for this. I'm sorry to throw that in as early as this now already. All of them are contested concepts, and probably every researcher will put a different definition forward. So exactly brainwashing, indoctrination, radicalization, extremism, all these kind of radicalism, terrorism, all these words make a mixture of concepts that are easily misunderstood, and also therefore debates often go wrong. And yeah, for me, I have for a long time, and I think with me many other scholars in the field as well have thought especially in the early days, radicalization as a concept is quite new, right? We don't use that for many centuries or decades. So it's something we started doing after 9/11 pretty much. And I hate the term radicalization, and at first I that was also a reason for me and my colleagues to find for other ways to describe the process, because that's how it came to be used as the process that leads an individual in the direction of extremism or terrorism. So people starting to become, the idea was that when people become more radical, so their worldviews start to become more radical and extreme, then at some point they come to the point, or might come to the point that they become terrorists. The whole link with the word radicalism, so that idea of extreme ideologies or viewpoints or systems of thought, is inherently problematic, because there are many individuals, also the people I spoke to, who are not per se very radical in their views. Well, they are in their actions at some point, especially those who make it to the terrorism phase. But the idea that violent thoughts and radical thoughts and ideas lead to the potential of violence is misunderstood, and that it's not necessarily so. So that's also why the concept of radicalization in itself is problematic. However, over time it became so integrated in our public discourse as a way of speaking to the phase that happened to terrorists or extremists, so those that use violence to achieve certain political goals or to change the system, that radicalization is about that phase. So it's not necessarily anymore about the ideological thoughts or beliefs they have, or the getting more extreme, but it's more about them getting on the pathway towards terrorism. That's how radicalization starts to be used more and more. I can relate to it, but still it's an uncomfortable term, because I really think that there's not a direct relationship between having extremist thoughts and doing extremist things or terrorist things. And brainwashing, that's something also that happens from the outside, right? So people getting brainwashed, and that's something that parents or societies or terrorist or extremist groups, or sects or cults, that they start to try and change your whole belief system, and then at some point that you fit in right into the system of a particular group, and that your ideas align with them. But radicalization as such can also be just a very individual process, always in relation with a particular social context. But it's not necessarily so that people are victims of brainwashing when they become terrorists or when they become extremists, right? People have agency too. They do things themselves as well. And that's, I think, for me, that's a problematic term with, for example, indoctrination or brainwashing. That when you say that people have been brainwashed or they have been indoctrinated with a particular thoughts, well, surely propaganda and all kinds of things happen, and they surely can have their effect. I think it takes away the agency of the individual. It also goes through the whole process. So that's, for me, radicalization is a problematic term, but it's maybe the best we have.
So I want to jump back to something really interesting that you said that I never properly thought about before, and that's the phrase that violent thoughts or radical thoughts don't often lead to violence. And just intuitively for me, that seems like a little bit of a weird phrase, something that I would not thought. Yeah, like I wouldn't have thought that's the case at all. Can you explain what actually does lead to radicalization if it's not these violent or radical thoughts? Or sorry, let me rephrase, not radicalization, extremist action.
Well, I wouldn't say often, but there are definitely cases in which people are not very deeply involved in the in extremist ideologies when they, for example, join a terrorist group. And that is something which sounds very strange, right? It's that you think that when you do something that extreme, become member of a terrorist organization or extremist group, whether it's right-wing, jihadi, or whatever group it is, left-wing, and that you then claim that not every person who ends up within extremist networks is necessarily a radical or has radical thoughts. And that is, so I realize that, but still there are, I think when you want to understand why people join these networks or these groups, then you have to look at different domains of life. So, and you see that individuals often follow different pathways into these acts or these groups. And one of them can be definitely ideology. Ideology is very important in radicalization processes for many. It helps to explain and understand the world people live in, the injustices that are being carried out, and also it explains people patterns of action which they need to do in order to right the wrongs in society. So if people join extremist networks, ideologies definitely are important. However, there are also individuals who are very we're dummies in the sense of ideological understanding of actually what they are up, what they're doing, and they are much more attracted or get more involved into particular groups because of other push or pull factors in extremist networks. For example, social networks or social identity forming, or practical advantages of particular groups. I've seen also in the research I did on foreign fighters, people who were not definitely ideological trained individuals who were actually arrested, and that they didn't even know the basics of the religion they were claiming to support with their joining of extremist networks, but they went there for very other reasons, and that goes for individuals. For example, you also, and it doesn't have to be that people don't have a religious or ideological system in which they look at the world. That people always have that, but if you want to point at a particular factor that inspired them to do particular things, then for many people it's not ideology in isolation, or it's for some it's even not even based on ideological grounds, but there are, for example, social factors, friends who you got involved with, or it's a way of dealing with practical circumstances. What makes people what leads people to make more extreme choices than they would have done otherwise. For example, I've met a girl who traveled to the Caliphate, to ISIS territory, and a very important reason for her to do so is that she met this guy online. She fell in love with this boy, but who was already there. But also she was being subjected to abuse at their home situation. So also for her, the road to ISIS territory, to ISIS, was very much inspired also by other factors than ideology or than extremist ideas. And the same goes for right-wing extremists. There are stories in right-wing circles where people are there because it's also, and this also might sound weird, that it's also fun to be part of such a group, right? It gives you a social network, it gives you friends, it gives you all sorts of exciting adventures, activities, it gives you protection from outside world. So there are many benefits to extremist groups. However, in public, but also in academic debate, we still often talk about that radical part, right? About the thoughts and the ideas and the ideologies these people have. And although they're important in justifying their actions and in inspiring people to do the same, it's definitely not the only source why people become terrorists.
So, would you say that it's fair to say that, like, you've seen any sort of pattern in the way that extremists recruit and the way that people join these networks? For example, like, just something that in my non-expert opinion seems to make sense is that although ISIS and the KKK are like fundamentally like at odds with each other, the ways in which they sort of harness propaganda and like identity politics and nationalism is very similar in terms of attracting a similar like demographic of young men of a particular religion or race. And like you said, ideology may have little to do with it, but are there any common tactics that you see extremist groups from all across the ideological spectrum, all across the world, use to recruit new members?
Yeah, so I think so propaganda also in itself doesn't exist in some kind of vacuum, right? So it's always about real stuff, and it's also about, it's not just about real stuff, but it's also about sharing a message that is understandable, right? And it's about often about black and white, right? So in terms of there's no gray color in between. It's extremes, which you tell in your story, and it highlights the basic thoughts and ideas for these groups, and therefore ideology. It's not that it doesn't matter, right? Or it hardly matters. It really matters because it is exactly the frame which you want people to become part of when they join a group or a network. However, it's not a driving factor in itself, but or not for everyone at least. But it is sharing. Propaganda does exactly, I think, sharing this narrative, right? So it is about sharing what the world looks like, where people are in, and it helps them understand the wrongs and the grievances they're being done, right? So it helps them understand that from a right-wing extremist perspective. It helps them understand that multicultural societies don't work because there's much more violence and it's much better. So it is this message that's being shared, and from jihadi networks, it's about disbelief, and it's about discrimination. It's about so it is about understanding the injustices of society or injustices of other societies as well, and it's also about this propaganda message. It's about that injustices. It's about also providing ways of better worlds or things that can be done or how the world could look like. So also a way forward and what could be done. But I think what modern propaganda characterizes is that it's beyond only the ideological message of these groups. So as I said, so there are particularly three dimensions of why people become attracted or become motivated to join extremist groups. And one of them is definitely ideology, but the two others are also important. So it's also about the social identity and the powerful group you're going to belong to. And it's also about the practical advantages and the fun life you'll have within that group or part of that group. So it's about providing an image propaganda that covers all these aspects. So it shares the ideological message, it shares the social aspects of becoming part of the group, and it shares the practical advantages. And that's what you've seen, and that's, I think, also in the last years, how propaganda has changed. In the past, especially when you look at the old Al-Qaeda propaganda videos, it was just a guy, and most of the time it was Bin Laden, talking these very long ideological hardcore talks which nobody understood, and it was all in Arabic, so people, half of the world, didn't really understand what was being said. And I think modern day propaganda messages are much more dynamic, they're quicker, and they're open to a much larger audience than this small hardcore present in every society. And that is because it's not just only about ideology, it's also about social identity, and it's also about practical advantages.
Yeah, so we talked about how basically people join these organizations and the reasons why they do so. Now I want to talk a bit more about the solutions to radicalization, because it's quite hard to imagine, the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys as far-right groups in the US sort of becoming more moderate or changing their beliefs. But you did mention that it is possible with individual agency to sort of shift away from extreme beliefs without needing to be deprogrammed. So can you explain a bit more, how can this happen? Do you need to have certain personality traits? Are there certain outside pushes that the state can use to help people? How does this happen?
Yeah, so the good thing is that most people at some point, even when they become more and more extreme in their thoughts and their behaviors, most of them do not join extremist groups, actually. And when people do, most of them actually at some point get out of it. So that's the good news. And there's it's definitely possible for people to get out. There are a couple of things that might hinder people from actually doing so. So actually, I think that if you look at radicalization processes, then so the pathways towards extremist groups and towards terrorism, then you have these different reasons why people become involved, but there's also different reasons why people might want to quit, because they get disillusioned with the ideology, right? So the story that they have been told actually don't seem to really work in practice, or that the social group they now are part of, whether it's ISIS or right-wing extremist groups or a neo-Nazi group, that they in practice turn out not to be the people you want to be involved with, because they're unkind, or you're disappointed in you're disappointed in how they operate. You have experienced certain grievances as being part of that group. So that might also be a reason why people want to quit. And it might also be that you, for example, have very practical reasons, again, to get out, right? It might be a reason for people to get in, but it might also be a reason to get out. You want to have a normal life, you want to have a career, you want to meet, you want to have a family. All these kind of stuff are much more difficult when you're part of extremist groups. So the reason, so all these reasons why people get involved might also be reasons why people want to get out. And then the problem is that some of them might start doubting it, but have encountered certain barriers or obstacles, which, despite their increasing wish to get out, might still keep them in. So these are so-called barriers to disengagement. So, for example, somebody might want to leave the group for whatever reason. However, ideology, again, might prevent people from actually leaving, because they'll be, they believe still, or they might still believe that they'll end up in hell for that. So it might still be a reason why people, despite their doubts, stay in. It might also be that they might fear the group, right? So that they want to leave, but what are the consequences from a very practical perspective? Will there be repercussions, or do you need to worry about your own safety? So that might also still keep people in. Or people fear stigmatization, so that people might want to leave, but feel that they will never have a normal career because they'll be stigmatized by society, because they'll always see them as an ex-terrorist. So all these different, or maybe as a last example, all your friends are still there, right? So you might want to leave, and you might feel you doubt the ideology, or you doubt the practical life and circumstances, but you'll still end up staying with the group because your friends are there. You don't really believe still the goals of the organization, and you don't really believe in the tactics either, but your friends or your lover is still in the group, and that means that you'll probably stay in as well. So this whole process, of this whole matrix of why people end up there, why people might doubt, but also why people might still stay in despite their doubt, that is something where governments or organizations can actually do something. So the first thing is that if you want to get people out, there must be a reason for them to do so themselves. So there's always has to be this personal motivation for people to want to quit or to want to get out. And if you find that reason, then there's ways for governments to deal with the barriers people might encounter when actually trying to get out. So if people want to leave an organization, but feel that they're being subject to societal stigmatization because they have this big swastika tattoo in their neck. Well, one thing that organizations do in the US as well is that they help getting rid of these tattoos, just to make sure that people actually are able to reintegrate into society again, that this whole idea of stigmatization tones, that the risk becomes lower. Or when people doubt whether they actually can leave because they'll end up in hell, then there might be a religious or an ideological expert, a religious figure, who can actually talk to you and explain that there are other interpretations where this might not be the case. Or when there is a security threat, then the police might be involved in order to guarantee protection. So I think the role of governments is not per se in stimulating people in the first instance of getting out terrorist groups, but it's mainly about getting rid of those barriers which might keep people in despite their doubts.
So, in reshaping this, I think that there's a sort of important role to be played by societal attitudes and the way that people think about extremists. For example, in Canada, like Omar Khadr, who was a Canadian citizen, recently got a whole bunch of money because he was detained at Guantanamo Bay and he was a child, and the Canadian government didn't come in to like protect his rights or whatever. But a lot of the Canadian public, when they see a guy like Omar Khadr, you know, who's been an extremist, and was fighting in Afghanistan despite being a Canadian citizen, they sort of see that and are left like with a sense of disgust or a bad feeling about the fact that, okay, this guy's a former extremist and he gets to live a good life and the government's helping him out. Of course, even though the case is much more complicated than that, the sort of like feeling that society has towards members that have joined extremist groups and committed crimes as part of extremist groups is a feeling of vengeance, of hatred, of, you know, these people are evil, they're the scum of society. How do we reconcile that with the fact that, yes, they've committed these crimes, and yes, they're coming back, yes, they've been in, like, you know, they've been a part of these groups that have committed massive harm to the country, massive harm to our citizens, but at the same time, the only solution is with them as citizens of the country to bring them back to the country. How do societal attitudes play a role in rehabilitation?
Yeah, so I think there are multiple levels to your question, which I think is an interesting one. So on the one hand, it tells us something about our relationship to risk, right? And it is something that as a society we are very occupied with risks posed by technologies, but also by individuals, and also the preventing of those risks from actually materializing, from actually that something really goes wrong. So we're not very good anymore, for different reasons, to deal with the fact that certain things are, well, can always happen, right? That there's always a danger to certain things. For example, to terrorism, there's always a chance of terrorism to occur. That's also the scary part, and that's also the powerful part of terrorism, that it might always happen, and it might always, that it keeps us occupied in that sense. And the same goes, of course, for recidivism, right? Is if somebody, whether or not he or she was found guilty, and but the fact that somebody has been linked to something extreme as terrorism, that brings about feelings of anxiety, because there's always a risk of people committing such crimes again, or that they might at the end still would commit the crimes. So I think it tells us something about how we relate to risks and how we are willing to accept the fact that things can go wrong. And it goes beyond the idea of terrorists. It is also related to other high-risk offenders, right, or high-profile offenders, as I called it in my own work. So there are, I think, the societal outrage and fear of particular prisoners or people who have been incarcerated, is interesting itself to when looking at their public profile. And I think terrorism are definitely one group which create fear and anger, but also the same goes for pedophiles or people who have been in sexual cases of sexual assault and that kind of stuff, or murderers who have had a very public case. So all these figures, they create they create these societal responses, and that is something that I think is just a fact. And I've seen several cases where prisoners or terrorists were released from prison, and where their neighborhood where they would end up living started protesting, started doing petitions like, we don't want this person to live here. And the same goes with people with a different high-profile case. So that's that. So it is a fact, and it definitely, stigmatization is definitely problematic if you want to reintegrate people, because it is about people trying to find their way in a different kind of life, away from extremism or from crime. But then there has to be an option actually to be part of that life, and then with this, you would expect that with this kind of stigmatization, that becomes problematic. And the good thing is that that's, for many people, it's not the case. So the case you mentioned of Kader is one extreme case, right? It has been a case where there has been attention worldwide to this particular case, and the same goes to particular cases on a national level. Also, in particular, foreign fighters who joined ISIS, they made the news, they have been on television. For them, it's a different story. But there are also many individuals who are still quite anonymous, and they are still. It's quite possible actually that society doesn't really care about these people. Well, actually, if you're going to make it explicit and tell them like, oh, you know who lives next door, yeah, that's a terrorist, then I would be worried. Yeah, then people would be definitely would respond. But in most cases, if you deal with these cases in discretion and in a particular way, then it's actually quite well. It's an option to actually to reintegrate them quite anonymously and quite well. And I've seen cases, for example, where local governments were worried about the release of a particular prisoner, and they were monitoring the neighborhood where he would go and live for weeks, and the neighborhood still didn't really bother, although everyone knew that this person was going to live there again. And one of the main reasons is that most people actually knew the guy in the environment, and although that he committed a terrorist attack, people knew what he was about, and that actually he distanced himself from his previous acts, and so there wasn't a lot of societal outrage on a local sphere. And that's, in the end, that's the place where people have to live. So on a national level and on a societal level, people are still very worried about these high profile cases, and sometimes rightly so, right? Some people who it might be scary, but in not every local community is turned upside down when somebody from an extremist background is reintegrated.
So I think in recent years, we've seen the rise of these lone wolf terrorist attacks. And the idea that groups like ISIS are no longer about a centralized hierarchical organization, but rather some ideology that penetrates deeper than that, a way of radicalizing mostly young men into committing terrorist acts in name of this group or state that they'd like to have that's very far away. Like a lot of these recent terrorist attacks in America have come with a terrorist like live streaming or like, creating a video, pledging allegiance to ISIS while committing an act in America without any known contact to any centralized extremist hub or network or anything like that. They just have seen the content that this group has put out and have decided, okay, I'm going to be a part of it. And the group even asked them, just pledge allegiance to us when you commit an act. It doesn't matter if you have anything to do with us or have formally been integrated into our organization in any way. I think that this, to me, just leaves me thinking a lot about, the security state and surveillance and things like that. And in my head, I just can't figure out how we balance the rise of lone wolves and our own personal freedoms. Because on one level, it seems like we have to, be quite invasive in people's, message data and seeing which websites they're accessing and who they've been in communication with in order to stop these attacks from happening and saving lives. But on the other hand, giving the government the power to do so opens up a whole other can of worms related to state surveillance. How do you feel the best way to balance these two things is?
Well, I think you sketched the dilemma perfectly because this is what it is, right? It's about balancing, So it is about um, well, there are a couple of things, a couple of thoughts, and a couple of ideas. It's definitely about finding a balance between. I think every investigation should always start with, what's the least intrusive way of doing an investigation? And do we really need to, well, get all the material and all the technologies out to surveil and to monitor this person, right? And I think um, that should always be the starting question, and there should be enough oversight by independent organizations or organizations tasked with actually monitoring whether this has actually been done, right? Whether this protocol has been followed, um, and it's also part of public discourse and of all different, and also of academics, to also debunk myths which might be used to justify particular extreme measures to deal with particular threats. So the first thing I think should always be clear is that there will never be a solution to make the world perfectly safe. And if there would be a solution, that it would be very suboptimal. So there will so it's our task, I think, as academics, as politicians, as policymakers, to constantly keep this message out there that you'll never be completely safe, and that's okay too, because that's what life is about. And so you can actually, and for every thing you come up with, people who want to do wrong, they'll find a way. It's very easy to commit a terrorist attack, and you can't surveil. And we have seen that over the last years with these small scale individual attacks, as you said, where just people go out on the street and start stabbing people. These are very scary thoughts, but well, many of them wouldn't have been able to prevent when you would have had access to all the data out there in the world. This could always happen. Um, and then there's the other thought, is that you say, well, one of the reasons I think, or one of the things that has scared us a lot, and it has started also with, well, you had a couple of attacks also in the US, but also in Norway with Anders Behring Breivik, where individuals, and a couple of incel attacks as well. Individuals who radicalized pretty much well, seem to radicalize or seem to become more extreme in isolation. And then suddenly, boom, they were there, and there was this huge attack with a lot of casualties. When you look closer, they were all branded lone wolves, and well, how could that be done? Because lone wolves are not in contact, and we can't survey them, and we can't find them. They're everywhere. And that kind of narrative started to emerge. And then when you look closer at these cases, you'll see that there's always a community which they are part of, and it's not always a physical community. We're still often thinking, right, about that. Oh, you can't be, well, you can't be connected to people when it's not in the physical world. But all these individuals were in some way connected to others who are like-minded or want to be connected in the digital world. So many incels, and I studied them myself as well, they have fora where they are in contact with each other, and some of them have announced attacks over the web. Breivik has been very active on public fora and also in the physical world, in trying to buy all sorts of good fertilizer from which a bomb could be made. So there'll always be traces of individuals and their social networks, even when they appear to operate on their own. So it's also another myth, I think, that the myth of lone wolves. It's something we should debunk, because it's a very, very one-dimensional idea of that's a thing. Well, in many cases, it's not the most appropriate way to describe these cases. And it's also then the solutions we will propose based on this image will be the wrong ones, because the idea that there's nothing well, to be investigated in the physical world, it's not true. And the same it goes that there have only been a couple of real lone wolves, and maybe the person coming closest has died a long time ago. So yeah, so that will be the Unabomber, and so yeah, I think so. So that would yeah, that would be my first ideas.
Thank you so much. I think this is a good time to wrap up. Thank you so much for your ideas and input and coming on the show. It was definitely very interesting to hear your research, and see you again maybe soon.